and General, Dr. Green, good to see you. I want to thank you for your great work that you've been doing, not only on this report, but for years. Very much appreciated. You know, one of the things about the Asia Pacific, and you mentioned it to Senator Hirono earlier, a lot of us are certainly interested in it. You know, my state is an Asia Pacific state. And I think it's an opportunity, a rare one to be honest, where you have the legislative branch supporting the executive branch on a major foreign policy strategy, the so-called pivot or rebalance to the Asia Pacific. I think you see a lot of support in this committee for that. However, your report kind of makes it a little bit clear that that's not necessarily the most cogent strategy. How would you describe that strategy right now in one word?
The rebalance strategy?
Yes.
Well, if I were given one word, it would be rebalance. That sounds like a cop-out.
It is.
Part of the problem with this articulation of the strategy is that rebalancing is a process. It's a ways, not an end. And I think what we've lacked in the articulation of the strategy is an articulation of the Asia-Pacific and the kinds of relationships that we're aiming for and what we will and will not tolerate.
So how would you improve it? And in particular, not just the strategy, your report stated that the Obama administration has not articulated a clear, coherent, or consistent strategy for the region. So not just the strategy, but the FONOPS issue, which I think many of us, again, bipartisan, are very interested in. We've encouraged the administration to get behind those as a regular occurrence, routine missions and operations with our allies if possible. But in my discussions with some of our allies, there seems to be enormous confusion, even on the articulation of what we're trying to do with those. How would you help improve that?
So we mentioned this in the report, Senator. The speeches by the senior-most officials in the administration articulate our priorities for the region differently every time. I think the Secretary of Defense and his predecessors have had the most consistent articulation, but there is not the kind of consistent explanation of our priorities that we need, or that you had in previous administrations articulating our strategy towards the region. I mentioned this earlier, but we have at the senior-most levels embraced a vision that Xi Jinping put forward for a new model of great power relations, which is a great power condominium of Russia, China, and the U.S. And our allies were, you know, unhappy, understandably. And so how we've articulated this at the most senior levels in terms of how we see the order and future of the region keeps shifting. That's one problem. We also, I think, in the FONOPS we don't have a story. I mean, the Australians, the Japanese, the Philippines, all our treaty allies wanted us to do freedom of navigation operations after this, you know, alarming Chinese reclamation and building of military spec airfields across the South China Sea. The first was near Subi Island. It was a low tide elevation. We did it as a innocent passage because it was also near, within 12 nautical miles of a island feature. So that was confusing. The most recent one it was more consistent, but ultimately, as the chairman articulated at the beginning of the hearing, ultimately we need to demonstrate that we do not accept these new artificial island outposts as having any legitimacy in terms of territorial waters. And we need to do it consistently, and we need to make it appear we're not doing it reluctantly, because the first FONOP came after a sort of Macbeth-like to do or not to do drama in the press. So we need to show how we view the region, why our values and allies are at the center of it, and second, that when order, freedom of navigation are challenged, we don't break a sweat.
Let me ask, I'm going to ask one final quick question. Appreciate that you focused a lot in this report on the Arctic and the interest of different countries in the Arctic. And at the same time, you know, the President, we've done a lot on this committee to try and there's a lot of interest from a lot of different senators on the issues of the Arctic. We we're required DOD to have an O plan for the Arctic in the last NDAA. At the same time, as the President talked about strengthening our presence in the Asia-Pacific, they're looking at dramatically cutting our military forces, particularly our only airborne brigade combat team in the Arctic, in the entire Asia-Pacific. Do you think that our potential adversaries, whether it's the Koreans, whether it's the Russians, view that kind of cutback in a way that undermines the credibility of our focus on the rebalance and also on our focus late to the game, of course, on the Arctic, where the Russians, as you mentioned in the report, are dramatically increasing their presence? And that's for both of you, General.
If I may start, General, when the President announced the rebalance in Australia in November 2011, it was well received in the region. We've done polling where over 80% outside of China, over 80% of elites welcome or would welcome a U.S. rebalance. There are questions about implementation, but the idea we're going to do this is important to them. In that speech in Australia, the President said that defense cuts will not, and he said, I repeat, will not come at the expense of the Asia-Pacific region. So, you know, technically, is the 425 part of PACOM? It's a little gray.
It is.
Will our allies see it as such? Yes. So this would be the first cut in the Pacific since the announcement of the rebalance. You mentioned the Arctic. There are growing uncertainties about the future of, frankly, not only the legal status and the exploitation of the Arctic, but the security environment. I saw that General Milley, in response to your question in his hearing, said he would need to look at operational requirements before force cuts. And as we said in our report, that strikes us as the right sequence.
General.
I'm more simple. The Army said they regionally align the forces out of First Corps. That unit comes out of First Corps, which means you'll have less capacity and capability for the Pacific. The airborne aspect of it, I've been up there in your state and visited them, very impressive. I'm not one for giving it away because you just don't know when you might need it. I understand it might be a cost factor, but again, I go with that regional alignment that Army has dictated to the rebalance, and that's the First Corps and 425th being part of that. I understand that we've gone away with NORTHCOM, who owns Alaska and all that, but it's really the force shouldn't be drawn down because it's just paying another bill somewhere else. I'd be interested where that bill is being paid. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.